Hi, this is Alfred's Basic Adult Piano Course, Lesson Book Level 1. This video is Lesson 16, which covers page 21 in our book. Two songs, Merrily We Roll Along and Largo from the New World. Before we get to Merrily We Roll Along, at the very top of page 21 in the pink box, we're learning something new here. Tied notes. When notes on the same line or space are joined with a curved line, we call them tied notes. So the piano key is held down for the combined value of both notes. So in the little example there, you have a whole note, and you have a bar line, which means a whole note in the next measure. But instead of playing that whole note twice, let's say I'm on middle C in my right hand, and I'm counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The curved line there, the tie, means that I'm not going to lift and play again. I'm going to hold it down for both measures, but I'm still going to count the same. So it's going to go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're going to hold it down for a total of 8 counts. Definitely don't want to get in the habit of counting up to 8. Still count 4 for every measure if you're in 4/4 time. So our first piece on this page, Merrily We Roll Along. It says here, play the right hand and left hand separately at first and then together. And this is good practice for any new piece of music. Practice the right hand mezzo forte and the left hand piano. When you practice the left hand piano, when you practice the left hand, notice the left hand is all chords. Our C major chord, which we learned a couple lessons ago, and our G7 chord, which we learned the last lesson. Now, if you're not entirely comfortable with these chords, it's going to be challenging to play them soft. Soft means a lot of control, a lot of balance. So my thought is, go ahead and practice them loud. Be really confident with the notes first. Once you feel very confident and they're very even when they're loud, then you can back off and start getting a little softer. But yes, your goal is to get that piano, get that nice soft sound. Now it also says here, the melody should always be clearly heard above the accompaniment. So what does that mean? So the melody is the tune, the theme. And typically chords are not melody, chords are accompaniment. So your left hand is doing the accompaniment and Merrily We Roll Along. The right hand has the melody. So let's go through and I'm going to play for you just the right hand first. Notice there's 4 counts in every measure. The rhythms are not too complicated, just quarter notes, a couple of half notes, and the last measure has a whole note. Still in our middle C position here. C position with your thumb on middle C. Notice the first note, third finger, that's a clue that that's the E. And if you know the names of your notes, you can read it that way. If you like to read by intervals, that's fine too. So here we go from the beginning, just the right hand. So some things I noticed about the notes in the right hand. The first 3 measures, there are no skips. Everything moves by steps, meaning intervals of a second, whether it be up or down, or some repeated notes. If you look at the second measure, those are all E's. And the third measure, those are all D's. Now the fourth measure, we do have a skip. We have from E on beat 1 to G. So be careful with that little skip right there. When you get to the second line, the first 2 measures are the exact same thing you played in the first 2 measures of the first line. When you get to the third measure of the second line, it's a little bit different, but There are no skips. It's just D, D, E, back to D, and down the middle C. So the right hand's really, really contained. And there's no Fs. No Fs in the right hand. So your fourth finger is not going to be playing the entire piece. So process of elimination, you can just think to yourself, thumb, 2, 3, and 5. Those are the only fingers playing. So once you feel comfortable with the melody in the right hand, make sure you also comfortable with those chords in the left hand. Now, our first two measures in the left hand, notice it says in parentheses, tied notes. Every one of those notes in that chord has a curved line, has a tie. And that's really important. When you look at ties, and specifically look at chords, every note of that chord must be tied. If only one of them is tied, then the other notes play again in the next measure. But that's not the case here. All three notes are tied. I'm going to count out loud the left hand as I play it so you can see the effect of the tie. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you notice in your third measure, that's when we go to that G7 chord. When you play the left hand by itself, going to the G7 chord is probably not going to be too challenging. You've got a total of 8 beats on that C chord before you get there. The real challenge is when you put the hands together. So even though you want to go slow and you want to make sure it's very even, the transition between the second and third measure could be a little challenging. I'm going to try both hands together, and I'm going to play just the first line for you. Counting out loud too, just so we make sure we get our counts in. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the good thing about this piece of music is at the end of the second measure, remember your left hand is still tied, so it's not doing anything. Your right hand's on that E half note, so you have 2 beats to think about where you're going in the third measure. So the last hand position of the second measure is right here. What do I have to do now in both hands to get ready for my third measure? Second finger's on D. Well, if your hand position is right there and you've got curved fingers, your second finger on D is ready to go. G7 chord in the left hand. Thumb is already on G. Second finger should be above F. And remember, it's the 5th finger that's doing the most work. That's the only finger in both hands that's really moving. And there you go, there's your third measure. So a lot of times, if you're having trouble between second and third measure, transitioning with both hands, play the last thing of the second measure, which is here, going to beat 1 of your third measure. And just go back and forth, kind of bridging that transition. Same thing when you're going into the last measure. This is the last thing you're playing in both hands, right here. G7 chord in the left hand, D, second finger, right hand. And actually, you're going back to where you were in the beginning of the song. You're back to that E and C chord. When you go down to the second line, these 2 measures are again an exact repeat. And once again, G7 chord and the D in the right hand. So again, you're going from this position to here. Now continuing on that third measure. And now here it's a little different. Middle C in the right hand. But again, you're right here. G7 chord and D. Your thumb's already on middle C in the right hand. So there you go. So that's basically Merrily We Roll Along. The next piece is called Largo from the New World, Anton Dvorak. It's similar to Merrily We Roll Along. Look at the left hand. You've got lots of ties. C chords, and G7 chords. This time, the G7 is actually tied in the third and fourth measure on the top line. So notice there's a P, piano, marked in the bass clef because you want your accompaniment, your chords, to be soft. Your right hand is the melody, the tune, mezzo forte, so we want to bring that out. We want that to be heard. This piece is marked slow, so you also get more time to implement your chord changes. You're going to find that hands separate are pretty easy, but I would still start with, maybe playing just the right hand first. Notice right away, you've got to skip E to G. Second measure, you go down to E, skip down, and then it's just D and C. Next measure, here's a skip, skip back down, and then D. So in that whole line, there's no F. Once again, no F with your fourth finger. The bottom line, the first two measures are the exact same thing you played on the top line. Now this next measure is a little different. So it's quite similar in many ways to Merrily We Roll Along. Once you feel comfortable with the right hand, comfortable with the notes, the skips, the counting, the evenness, and you should be somewhat familiar now with these chords in the left hand, comfortable enough to start putting it together nice and slowly. Here we go. So the same advice I gave on Merrily We Roll Along. If you're having trouble between the second and third measure, where the chord changes are in the left hand, practice the last position you were on in the second measure with both hands, which is right there, and go into beat one of the third measure. And just go back and forth. Just practicing how that feels. Really focus on what changes, what moves, what stays the same. As far as both of these pieces go, there's one more little trick. Well, I guess it's not really a trick, but if you look at the bottom of the page, it says, in most popular sheet music, the chord symbols appear above the right hand melody. The symbol appears only when the chord changes. So at the beginning of Merrily We Roll Along, it's kind of tucked in there, but if you look above the treble clef and below the word merrily, there's a chord symbol C. So that means your left hand is playing a C chord. So you have two methods now of reading the C chord. You can actually read the individual notes on the bass clef and play the C chord that way. Or if you have it memorized that it's C, E, and G, when you see the C chord symbol, just play the chord. When you see the G7 in the third measure, if you've got the notes memorized, you can play it. If you're not so comfortable with that, it's okay. Read it there in the bass clef. So you have two ways of reading it. In fake music, I mentioned this in the previous lesson, you won't even see a bass clef. There won't even be notation. All that's printed is the melody in a treble clef. And then you have chord symbols. And it's up to you to play those chords, whether you play a C chord this way, or there are several other ways to do it, which we won't get into just yet. That'll be later on in the future. Same thing with the G7. But notice in the second measure, they don't put a C. Now, part of that is because it's still tied, so you're not going to be playing it anyways. And part of it is, like it said at the bottom, the symbol appears only when the chord changes. So if you have an entire piece of music that's C chords, you'll see C at the beginning, and that's it. Okay, so as usual, make sure you're very comfortable with both of these pieces before going on to the next lesson. And get really comfortable with your chord changes, and get really comfortable with the changes when hands play together. Again, just going back between these transitions, no matter what the notes are. And of course, remembering what a tie is and how that works.